So welcome back to Homeschooling 101, and today we're actually going to go through how to teach a homeschool lesson. And there's really a lot of things about teaching a homeschool lesson that are different than teaching a lesson to a class, either a class of homeschoolers or a class at a school. And so hopefully you'll find this very useful. As I said before, I am a teacher that I went to college to become a teacher. And I've said before that it's not as useful as you might think to have that background and homeschool your children, because there's really something different happening in that one-on-one exchange between yourself and your child, or even if you're teaching 2 or 3 of your children at the same time. It's a really different situation than a larger group. So one thing that isn't obvious to everybody about homeschooling, and I'm always kind of interested that homeschoolers don't talk about this more, especially when they're being criticized for other pieces that people are thinking about, is that there's this sort of really special, powerful thing that happens in homeschooling, where because you are that parent of that child, you have a wealth of knowledge about that child. You're going to know all the things that child has done, or almost all the things that they've done. You're even going to know movies they watch, trips they've taken. And so anytime you're teaching a topic, it's very easy for you to bring anything in, any new thing into context with what's happened before. And so you're able to build into any lesson this sort of like interconnectedness, this sort of spiraling loop of where everything goes together that enables a really rich learning experience. It's hard to explain, I think, to people, and it's something that takes a little while to think about. So I think it's something that homeschoolers are, less likely to talk about to other people maybe than some other aspects of homeschooling. But it's really maybe the thing that makes homeschooling so effective. I think it's really one reason that many homeschoolers achieve more than you might have expected them to, is this way there is of teaching where you're constantly connecting to other things and you're constantly preparing for things to come. And if you're not doing this, I'm hoping that this video will kind of help you get an idea of how that could happen, because later on I'm going to go through really specific situations. I have 2 specific lessons where I'll go through and show how that can happen. Also, the intimate class size and your knowledge of that, of your child, is something that allows you to easily judge the depth of their understanding. So many homeschoolers find that it's not necessary to do as much testing as a child does in a school setting. You may still want to incorporate that so that they can prepare for that in the future, or there's some times when a standard sort of test format is the best way to sort of judge something, but you really save a lot of time not having to be constantly testing, because with a few questions, both during the lesson, after the lesson, a month after the lesson, you can make sure that, that really stuck and that really connected. So particularly when children are young, but even I would say up through high school, there's a number of things that will just take less time teaching to your child, and because you're not having to do testing in the same way. This connection with your child also makes introducing new concepts particularly rich and less stressful, because as I'll show you in some of these specific lessons, without spending a lot of time on it, you're going to have the opportunity, as you may have already realized, to be preparing your child for things that are coming. And so without investing a huge amount of time, you still have this sort of incremental possibility where things are, in your child's own time, slowly expanded on until they don't just understand a fact, they understand how this all moves on a continuum, if you will. So, we're always saying this, and I just have to say it one more time in this situation. This is where playing the long game maybe is the most important. When you're actually engaged in teaching your child a lesson, giving your child instruction. And so I'm just going to say it again. Even if you didn't want to do this just because this is great parenting, in your school situation, your child needs to feel safe, they need to feel secure, they need to feel highly valued so that you're going to get those educational outcomes that you want to. Situations that are stressful or a child is concerned about what's coming next are really harder to have that child open to learning what it is that you want to have happen. So play that long game. Be forgiving of your child, and your child will probably be more forgiving of you for things that don't go well or a day that isn't exactly how you planned. But you still want to have that feeling of mutual respect, joy, love, clear boundaries. You want all that to come into your teaching style so that your child is open to what you have to say and I'm free to grasp everything. And plus, again, you're building on those long-term family relationships that I know we want to be best. So you want to be kind, of course, to your children. You want to be as patient as you can. And it's not always possible for everyone to be 100% patient, but most of us can find situations where we can think to ourselves that, okay, just be patient a little longer. But you need to also be patient with yourself. It's really easy to get stuck in this thought that since you're homeschooling your children, you owe them perfection, or that perfection is even possible. And instead, I think it's really better to go into the day thinking that, you're going to be your best you that day. You're going to be the best version of yourself that day, but that you're kind to yourself. If you forgot something, if things didn't go exactly the way, don't just be beating yourself up all the time, right? What you want your child to remember is that joy and that love of learning. And over time, things work out. Things don't have to work out every minute, every day, every week, even every month. You could even have a bad month, and it's still going to work out over time. Remember that if your child was in school, it's definitely not the situation that things would be going perfectly well for them every moment there. Of course, again, schools are great. Schools would work. Not this isn't meant as a bash on school, but just realize that it doesn't have to be perfection all the time. It's just you're moving towards that goal. The most important thing that you want, I think, is the thing I always wanted, is this long-term feeling of excitement and joy and passion towards learning new topics. If you can, through this long game, get your child to be open to you, to be open to be learning, to be wanting to learn new things, you've made your job a lot easier. So try not to get lost in that short-term game of, I want you to get semicolons down today. That's not the big picture, right? The big picture is the long game, is this love of learning, this love and joy with your family, okay? So just work towards that goal. And if you're working towards that goal, and that's your big goal, sometimes it just makes the day a lot easier than if you're just getting really stuck on the details. If you're able to raise up a child that loves the process of learning, and wherever it is you start homeschooling, you're going to make the rest of homeschooling so much easier for yourself. So that little bit of work at the beginning of whenever it is you're starting to make sure that everybody is on this page, this positive page, ultimately it makes it easier for you. If you just sit and think about it for a while, you can realize how having your child want to be doing the work is just way easier, right? And the last thing is sometimes we're with our children all the time, or we feel like we're with them most of the time. And so you can really think that you're giving positive feedback to your child when you're really not. So not saying anything or smiling or nodding or a thumbs up is something, that's something better than negativeness, but it's not as good as being specifically positive. And while something like "you're wonderful" is important, you're really specifically saying what it is that you think is going right is more powerful. And so, whether you're writing it on your child's homework or you're saying it, to make sure that's happening is just really essential. So we're going to start with one of the big questions that everybody has. Again, I'm going to get to this very specific part of how to teach a lesson, but let's start with this idea. And this is, how do I teach something I know nothing about? Now, this has really happened to me with computers. I am not a technology person. I've not ever even really been tempted to go on Facebook. I'd just rather go for a walk with somebody or go to lunch or maybe talk on the phone. And so I knew that when I started homeschooling, I immediately knew this is going to be the problem, is that I am not super great. Let's not even say super great. I am not even adequate on the computer. But the thing is that I also know that I'm great at teaching other things. And so when I go into my homeschooling at the very beginning, long time ago, before even computers were as big of a thing as they are now, I knew that I was going to have to find another way to make computers happen. So this is one of the beauties of homeschooling groups, right? And you can just use it with joy. 3 of the 4 homeschooling groups that I have, did 2 smaller ones in my home and 2 much larger ones in for a wider community. I incorporated computers. Like, I incorporated hiring people that we could split the cost and they were going to teach computers. And so for me, that was one of the pieces when my children were really young. Another thing is that you can educate yourself enough about a topic to teach it. I know someone who went into homeschooling who did not know that much about computers and is now a computer genius. She teaches computer classes, she does robotics, she does everything. So the other thing is that it's not impossible to think about this idea that you're just going to educate yourself enough that you're going to be able to teach it. This happens all the time. Also, we'll go into this as one of the ways to teach a lesson, but most curriculums will come with a teacher's manual, and the teacher's manual has specific things that you should remember for the day. So it's telling you, like, if you're teaching this topic, these are key facts that you want to impart to your child. And so you're not necessarily creating things from scratch all the time. You're looking through there and at a glance, you're like, oh yeah, check, 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 check. Remember, you also have the teacher's manual, so you have the answers, right? So this is hugely helpful. But also, there's a fair number of curriculums that offer very specific scripts that even say this here, ask this question here. Here are some possible answers your child might get. So this can make it so that you can review something that you've forgotten about, or sometimes teach something that you don't know as much about. I'm personally not a fan of using that if you really don't have a basic understanding of what is happening. But other people feel like it works great. So there's more than one way to do it. The other thing is, some people decide that they're going to learn a subject along with one of their children. So I know somebody who went to a chemistry class at the local community college with their oldest child, and she learned chemistry, and she hadn't even had it in high school, but she really got it down so that she could then go teach it to the rest of her children. So that's a subject. Some people are going to pick to do online learning for something that they just feel like, okay, this isn't something I really think I know enough about, so I'm going to get you a class on, we're going to do chemistry online, whatever the thing is. There's also a fair number of community programs that you can find. There's all kinds of scenarios where you can find some way to learn about something. And sometimes it's kind of really surprising. When my oldest children were young, they were just so interested in geology. Actually, that lasted for a long time. And so we actually joined an adult geology club. And they were happy to have younger kids in the program. They had amazing field trips. Oh, and they gave my children so many specimens. My basement, I think I might have 6 boxes of rock stuff. But anyway, that was a case where they could continue to expand for completely free using a community option. The ham radio is another one that has a great program for children. So here's an example. I know that my children need to know something about computers. And you might think like, well, what happened? You're so terrible at computers. Well, my children are computer experts. I have a daughter about to graduate in computer science, and I have several children that are very active in a variety of ways. In fact, my children are really helping me a lot put the whole thing together. But here's what I did. So again, I offered computer classes through homeschooling groups I developed. That's one thing you can do. You can trade teaching with a friend. I didn't actually do this, but a lot of people will do this. You can, you know, if you have a friend that really you feel like knows a ton about computers that's homeschooling, and you feel like you could really do a great language arts, you know, unit. Sometimes people just trade like that. You can incorporate computer literacy into other programs that or other extracurricular activities. So for example, my two youngest took a series of classes at the Troy Arts Center in New York, which you'd think like, that has computer stuff, but it does, because it had computer design classes, it had like learning the basics of computer programming. So even though they went to, you know, theoretically, it's an art program, it had a lot of computer worked into some of the classes that I could sign them up for. Libraries, I know, have well, of course, you know this too, have a huge number of computers. So I often see people at the library where they brought all of their children, and it's clear that they're homeschooling a few of them at one table, and a number of them are doing work at the library. And many libraries also have somebody there who helps people with the computer. So for free, I've known people who've made use of that situation to make sure that their children were up and running on the computer. Libraries offer other things too. My kids took classes in library science at libraries, and you know, a variety of things that they offer for free. You could pay a private tutor. You could pay someone to come into your home and teach all of your kids computer skills if you wanted to. You could use online videos. There's online videos for almost anything, and certainly for computers. You can look for camps or classes in almost anything for the summer to use in enrichment, or even to use as basic knowledge. So for example, here in New York, the community college, Hudson Valley Community College, offers in the summer a number of computer programs. So when my kids were like 6th to 8th grade, they could take, you know, learn to build your own computer, basic computer, whatever, like all these kind of things were just a little more advanced than they could get other place. You can also find free professional groups sometimes that do things. So for example, my daughter did something called DigiGirls, which was free, and you could go to different colleges, meet with different professors, and it was this whole program designed to get girls interested in computers. So the thing is, and they did another one through RPI and Union College. So there's sometimes if you just dig a little deeper, there's things that you could do for free that are really fantastic for enrichment. And again, that's a way of getting those other voices in there that we often talk about. Renee, what's been your experience with that?
I really like the idea of joining a club. And like Helen said, most of these clubs, these nature clubs and science clubs, they are thrilled when younger people show up. They really want to keep the passion for whatever that club is about to keep going. So they want to teach a younger generation. And they have a lot of patience. And they're going to work with your children to instill a love of whether it's geology, or we joined a club of bird watchers, and we were out in nature, and they were teaching my children and myself all about these various different birds. And those are great opportunities for you to supplement what you're doing at home.
Thanks, Renee. And you know, those many voices have a lot of different advantages. And for example, I would have never climbed through tunnels where you had to pull yourself through to chip rocks out of it. Like, I would have never done that. But my children wanted to. So, you know, with equipment provided by the club, they could go have that experience, and I could safely stand in the part of the mind where you could stand up and feel your spaces. So there's all kinds of advantages to using that. Okay, I'm going to just kind of run through some homeschooling teaching helps pretty quickly before we just start going into the very specifics of different ways that you can teach a lesson. And there's, obviously there's more, but I've picked out 4 kind of basic ideas. So the first thing is, we've kind of gone up over this, but these are just things I want to just hit really one more time. Make every effort to be interesting. Of course, you're going to be kind to yourself. Of course, you're not going to beat yourself up. You're going to do your best thing. But still, I'm always thinking to myself, whether I'm teaching at a consortium to a group of 25 people or I'm teaching to 2 of my kids, I'm thinking like, would I want to be listening to me right now? And this really helps me to try to be a little more animated and be a little more interested in my topic, because I have certainly sat through lectures or sermons or whatever situation where you're thinking to yourself like, oh my gosh, just stay awake, right? I mean, that's the worst feeling. Or trying to surreptitiously look at the clock, like how many more minutes, right? So if you just take a little more effort, it can go a long way. It can really reap those rewards that we want to have. And again, always be thinking about those connections. How can you pull in those connections? How can you make it all breathe? How can you make it all weave together in this way, this very unique, powerful way that homeschooling has to offer? Play that long game when whatever you're doing. The other thing is, you might know for certain that your child is an auditory learner. And so you might think it's fine if I just talk. I'm just going to talk, or I'm just going to read this book even maybe to them for a long period of time. And the thing is even if somebody learns well just by hearing, they probably will find it easier to learn and learn even with more depth if they also have some kind of visual. So really try to have some visual. Even if you're talking about a composer and all you have is a picture of the composer and play one of their songs, I mean, it's just not that much hard to add other pieces in so that you're getting everything. If you have a whiteboard, like I said, if you could only buy one thing, a whiteboard is so useful to be writing down key things for your child to memorize, because even though they have all those connections going on, it's still really helpful to pull out certain things, emphasize them through writing. And if you don't have a whiteboard, just have a lot of white paper. I certainly homeschooled when I was on vacation, or particularly when I was visiting my, when you're, maybe you have a long visit to a relative who's very ill, you don't have a whiteboard, really just white paper will work too. So that, I think we think about that with math, right? Like, okay, I'm going to write the problem down with math. We don't always think about it like just draw a little, some kind of diagram when you are talking about a science thing. Like, just really try to be writing it down so your child has that visual instead of it's just you talking. And if at all possible, tie in some hands-on thing as often as you can. It doesn't have to be really complicated, but it can just be enough to kind of cement an idea. I'm going to say it again. Give positive feedback often. Give positive feedback often. And this isn't something everybody agrees about, but a lot of kids really do better if they are allowed to do something with their hands while you're talking. So when I'm teaching, even classes at Consortium, all of my classes would have PowerPoints, and they would have notes where you would fill in the blank, because just that action of you're writing something down kind of helps keep kids going. So your children at home, you can do the same thing. You can have them draw a diagram of what you're basically saying. You can have them draw a picture about what you're saying. You might let them do clay or something else that's quiet while you're talking. Some curriculums actually come with things that a child will color, or maps that older kids will look at. Some people find that just too distracting. It's just a matter of preference. But I would really try to incorporate the visual with that auditory thing. And we live in a time where it's so easy to throw a video in anytime. And the video is great to get interest in, spark interconnectedness, but that's still not the same as while you are trying to teach a lesson, your child is writing some piece of it down, or you're showing them a written sort of map of what's going on. Okay, so we're just going to go into the first easiest option, if you will. And this is just 3 basic steps. And again, when we're talking about ways to teach a lesson, I'm thinking that people will probably teach a lesson all of these different ways at some time, and you probably have even different ideas. So one easy option is just tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them. So in this most basic idea, if you just had really basic skill to do for the day, I mean, maybe you're just going to open it up and you're going to say, hey, this is our spelling list for the week, and this week we're going to learn I before E except after C. Then you're going to show them examples, you're going to, teach the basic idea of why that is, and at the end you're going to just remind them, okay, so for this week, this is our lesson in spelling. It's quick, you're just going to go through it, ding, ding, ding. Another way to do that that's still pretty similar is you're going to open with a hook or with an experiment, and basically that's their way of figuring out what's going to happen. But that's asking them to think a little bit more. That's asking them to kind of try to figure out, oh, this is what's going on. I understand. This is what's happening. Then you're going to tell them what's happening, and again, you're going to tell them what you told them. One of the things I really, so like this whole slide is about review, right? So I just got done saying that less review is necessary, less testing is necessary with homeschoolers, and that's true, but some is still necessary. Sometimes I'm kind of surprised by how many people come in and talk to me about, my child isn't getting this, or they're not doing that. And after listening for a while, I can realize that they are sort of thinking that because their child understood something in that moment or in that week, that they're always going to understand it. It's not always obvious to everybody that you do still have to keep going over things. It is really good to review each topic, each lesson when you're done at the end, like this is what just happened, but to keep going back to it too. So let's say that for this particular example, let's say I was going to do a science experiment, because let's say that we were going to learn about electricity, and we were going to talk about open and closed circuits. I might start out by actually showing them a circuit, right? I might show them a circuit in the basement. I might show them a circuit that I have a little different pieces that I can snap together and show them how the light works. As I'm showing it to them, I'm asking them, what do you think will happen? What do you think is next? I'm not just like, this is going to happen, right? Well, they're going to think about it. They're going to have lots of questions, and then we're going to do it. Then I'm going to let them do it. That's our tell them thing. But at the end, I'm still going to review. So what do you think happened here? What are the big ideas that you learned from this, 20 minutes, half hour, however long we spent doing this? I'm still going to review it so that in that moment, they understood what just happened. Okay, so again, there's different ways to do this, but rather than just thinking that one time is going to allow something to happen, and it might, I would really think that most children are going to benefit from this kind of process of introducing the idea, having the experiment or doing the idea, and review it. At the end, you review it. This is what happened. And also, this is a really natural way for you to figure out, do they actually understand this? Because if when you are in the process of telling them what you told them or asking them what they think they learned, you can figure out a lot more about how did this go? Was this what I thought was going to occur? All right, so that's certainly one option. I think that's a very easy, straightforward way to do a lesson. Okay, so then we're going to also just briefly touch on this idea that I don't want to be making all these lessons, so don't panic if you're thinking to yourself like, what? I don't want to be teaching everything every time. I don't want to be making up these lessons. I don't think I know how to make up these lessons. So remember again that a lot of homeschooling curriculum is going to have a lesson all laid out for you. So whether you read through that lesson first and then present it to your child as if you thought of this all by yourself, or whether you're actually kind of in real time reading it, this can really help you with a lot of lessons. So especially with your first child, or if you, you don't know that you remember a particular topic, it is going to be all laid out for you. So don't have this feeling now of like, it's such a worry. Some people are never going to read a script. They're always going to prepare their own thing. All right, so now I'm getting into what I consider to be a uniquely homeschool lesson. And this is the format that I used with my children over and over and over again. And certainly it's not that you would necessarily do this with every single lesson, but I think that using it for key lessons is really, again, part of that sort of real powerful experience that we can give our children as homeschoolers, because it's taking advantage of what can happen naturally. So this has 5 sort of parts to it. It has building, and these are the things that you are going to do over time leading up, because you know that you're going to do a particular lesson in the following months. Sometimes it even could be the following, like it could be summer and you know what's coming for the next year. The next thing is the introduction, where you're actually introducing the lesson. And this is when you'll pull back to all that building you did, so that it all seems very incremental. It just sort of seems natural. It just seems intuitive. In fact, it's not uncommon that if you've done the building and the introduction right, that your child basically can just tell you the lesson before you even say it. Like they've already been so set up perfectly to know what's going to happen. And then then you're not done there, because at the end you're going to form connections and you're going to practice this skill, this new skill, and you're going to review, because again, it's still important to make sure that that piece is in there so that your child can have those, sort of ideal outcomes. So let's go over those steps a little more. So building is so easy as a homeschooler, because you naturally in your life is just so rich. And it allows so many things to have context, to make the content make sense. You can build excitement through building, that something's happening. You can help your child to understand why something is going to be exciting and what its real world function is and how it works in with other things. So that introduction, by the time you're actually sitting down at your table and you're introducing the topic, you can then bring back these experiences or situations that you kind of ticked off in your head that are building towards the other thing. And sometimes I even write them down for myself. Or if you're at a field trip, you might just take a picture of something that you're going to later on bring back as the introduction to kind of, sort of be like, oh yeah, I remember that. So that introduction is bringing all those things that happened before, and usually some kind of new piece of information to kind of blend together, so that the child is like, oh, okay, see how this all fits together. Then you're going to give the lesson, and you're going to ask more specific questions. So if in the introduction you're asking open-ended questions, like let's think about how this fits together, let's think about all these things that we kind of connected, after the lesson you're kind of going for those more specific questions. Like you want to really kind of figure out, like, okay, now does my child understand this particular lesson in the depth that I want them to understand? And if they do, great, you're going to go to the next step. If not, you might want to go a little farther with your lesson. You might want to bring in some more examples before you move forward. So the form connections in practice is probably, maybe is longer than the lesson or the other things that have happened. So you are going to, after the lesson part is over, you're going to spend time actually, again, forming those connections and connecting it to future events, connecting it to things that are happening, even current events or their current life. You're going to really try to make it all seem part of that spiral, that part of a connection that all, you know, comes together. You, depending on what it is, you probably are going to have some kind of practice. So if it's a new skill and it's a younger child, or it's a child that you don't know about their focusing abilities, if it's this new idea, you probably want to watch them do the first few questions in their language arts book or in their science or whatever. You want to just make sure, okay, yeah, let's move along. Let's make sure we've got this. And the last thing, again, is that review. So obviously you can do a lot of this just verbally, and it doesn't have to be that day, right? Like you can tie it into experiences that happen a week later, a month later, a year later, you're going back to it. And review could be workbook pages, it could be a paper, but it could be an experience that you're going to provide that is related to review. So let's go into the specifics of this step by step. So let's say that you're teaching carrying or regrouping. So when you have enough ones to make a 10, or you have enough 10s to make 100. So this is kind of a big leap for some children in math. And so when we're building and we're at home, we don't have to just build because of the math book. We can build in because of the experiences that we find ourselves in that are going to make it all work for the child. And in building, I don't think you really need to lay it out what's happening. I think the younger the child is, the more confusing that is, and the older your child is, it can be really annoying. So it's better to do it in this sort of casual way that you're gonna pull together later. So these are actual things I did with my youngest children when we were moving into caring for them, my two youngest boys. So we were at a baseball game, and I could see that this is coming, and so I was able to show them, hey, look at this board and watch what happens. And so of course you can follow this, that eventually the score, hopefully, the score is going to get into the 10s. And at that point, you can just point that out, like, oh, it moved over when it was not, after it got to, 9, it moves over and there's a 1 and a 0. You don't have to spend a ton of time on this. Like if it's a teaching moment and they want to do it, great. But all you really have to do is point it out, like this happened. So it's things like that that are going to come into their life. You could also try it with a clock. During this time, we were doing a lot of work on our house. So I was able to show my children a bill. This isn't actually my bill, where we could look at somebody who had done painting, and we looked at somebody else who had done some carpentry work. And without really getting into a whole lot about it, I was able to show them that little 1 mark that the person had used and just say, oh, well, this is carrying. Again, I didn't have to go into it a whole lot. I'm not trying to, make it a moment that lasts forever. Again, it's just these rich experiences that are starting to incrementally lead towards what is the big event. So, still as part of building, you can build the idea into what's coming. Okay, so for example, my boys, every day of school, the first day of school, we put 1 penny on their actual hundreds chart. The next day they did 2 pennies. But when they got up to 10, I don't know if you can see here, but there's these little orange things that we call their 10 card, their 10 trains. And so each train could fit 10 pennies in it. So at first we're just counting and saying like, okay, this is 10 pennies. But then we get to the point pretty quickly where I can say like, but actually, if you get to 10 pennies, I would give you a dime, because that would be the same thing. That would be equal to the same thing. And I'm not getting into carrying at all, but I'm just explaining to them this idea that's coming. And so I could just briefly say to them, without going to a lot of explanation, but just say like, this is also happens in math, where you can take this like 10 pennies becoming 1 dime. It just becomes one thing, right? And again, this is just a little piece. You don't have to, you don't have to kill them with the details, but there's a little incremental piece that happens really fast. I mean, this is the you know, amazing thing about it, right? You're with your child all the time. So you'll find all kinds of ways that this can work in. So one thing I did with most of my children is sometime they were going to the store, whether it was to buy a candy bar or it was to buy something else, we brought a bunch of pennies. And of course, you have to go to a store where people aren't like really busy or behind you, so that you're not, you know, really being annoying to people. But have the child experience buying things with a penny. So even if you just go buy, you know, $1.10 worth of candy for your child, you can, without making a big deal of it, just comment like, "It takes a long time, right? You know, what else could happen?" You know, and of course they're going to come to the idea like, well, $1 would have been easier, or dimes could have been easier. And you just kind of leave it at that, right? You're just like, yeah. Or, you know, if it's the right moment to keep going, you can keep going. But I'm just giving the idea that you're building up to what's to come by just little moments. You're already at the store. You just happen to, at that time, bring out the pennies. Okay, so now we're moving into the introduction. You've done the building, and they don't, obviously it doesn't have to be those things. I'm just really trying to give you an idea of how this can work. So you've done the building in your life. It worked in little pieces in different ways to things that your child was doing at that time, okay? So next, we're still doing, you know, carrying, often called regrouping now. Now we're into the introduction. It's the day that I want to teach my two youngest boys carrying, okay, or regrouping. And so I'm going to sit down with them, and as the introduction, we're going to go over all of those real world life experiences that they've had, and also the events where that they've done, you know, with their pennies and their 10 cart. And we're going to ask a lot of questions, like, why does regrouping happen? You know, like, why is it important? And of course, they've been to the store, they've seen the whole penny thing, they've seen the bill, they've been to the basement, like, they've already got it. And in my particular situation, they both, before I even said, okay, and now this is what, you know, regrouping is, they already had it, right? And all I had done is given them some real world experiences for the introduction. So in this particular case, the lesson wasn't even needed, but of course, you know, I still did it as part of review, but it was very short, versus this is something that teaching to a large group would go a lot differently, right? But I know then that they both understand it and I can move on. So as part of the introduction, another thing you could do, I've done before with children, is just give them a calculator or a cash register and ask them to push the buttons, and they'll also start to see how those numbers flip over. That's one other thing you could do. But anyway, you know, you're going to teach the lesson. And if your child doesn't have the lesson from the introduction, which of course is what often happens, you're going to then use manipulatives to just demonstrate. So you can see here, I'm sitting next to my two daughters, and actually I don't unfortunately remember what I was teaching them at that time, but it must have been some new topic, because I've got the abacus out, I've got the block based 10 blocks, or maybe those are Cuisinart out there. So obviously I'm using the manipulatives in different ways to help them with a new idea. We're doing a lot of work. They seem to be really thinking about, like, what's the thing that's happening next? So if you have all those things work really well for whatever you're doing, but particularly, let's say you were doing this. But the other thing you can do is just have a bunch of dimes and pennies ready, and then when you're carrying, whatever you're carrying, you're exchanging the pennies for the dime. You're exchanging the dimes for $1. You're going through that actual process, so that when you carry a one, they can see, oh, but I really am carrying a dime here. And then you have 10 dimes, and they can say, oh, but really, these 10 dimes I'm carrying are becoming $1. So just sort of play acting it out, if you will. And again, you get to praise your child for understanding it, whatever part of it they understand. And this is a lesson that could take a lot of time, or it could take less time. But the big idea is that you are you're being positive and you're seeing, you know, what happens next. You know, you're open, as the homeschool parent. It could be that this lesson's very short because they understand it, or it could be the lesson's very long because you have the time to make sure that your children understand it. So you're going to ask those more specific questions. You're going to look for total comprehension because you want to make sure that they really got this. And if needed, you're going to just keep practicing until the child feels comfortable. And one thing in a new idea, I think it's really important, is to see if the child can tell you the process back. Can they reiterate back? Can they sort of teach it to you? Is always a fun thing for them. Like, okay, pretend I don't know how to do this. You explain to me using the dimes and pennies, how does this work? Like, you tell me. And you know, that's always a joy too. I wish I had taken videos of a lot of those things. So by then, you know, your child understands it. Let's say you've got to the point that they understand it. Maybe they don't, and maybe you're thinking, okay, I'm going to stop here now, and we're going to go back tomorrow, and we'll start it again. You know, it's not necessary to just go and go and go and go, right? So let's say you're at the point where they've definitely got it. You're now into connections that you want to form and the practice. So during this time, now they really understand it. You're going to, again, go back to their past experiences and put those in a little more context. And you're going to think of things that might happen in the future and how this goes yet. Like, you're really trying to connect this. First of all, this really helps them understand better. It really gets it stuck in their brain. And even though it might not be obvious to you when your child is younger, having that ability to put things together, understand how things fit in the world, is really necessary for that higher level thinking and higher level learning. It's just, your child has that down. They're just so much ahead of people who don't, if that happens. So here in this case, we have my son, and you can see he's got his workbook open for math, and he is doing his, it's a thing for geometry where you, sort of spatial reason, where you stretch rubber bands and you make designs, okay? So for example, in this situation, I was very surprised, but he said to me, you know, you could say that 10 small blue rubber bands equal one big brown rubber band, right? And of course, that's a really big idea. And so you can talk about that for a while. So you're really expanding on this idea of how things connect. Let's think a little bit more about this before we just let it go. Okay, you're moving through it even more. So, you know, next thing that you would probably want to do is sit there. It seems like everything's good. They verbally got it, but it's a new thing. So you would sit there, watch them do at least some problems, maybe all of the problems for a new thing. If you find your child understands it, you know, you're going to give those comments. But if you feel like your child doesn't understand it, of course, you don't want to just be super negative. Like, you don't want to say a negative think about their abilities. You don't want to, if you can avoid it, sigh around. You also don't want to just make these blanket statements like, oh, you don't get this math, or you don't understand anything. You don't want to say anything like that. The easiest thing is to model it again, right? You're going to model what they could have done that would have made it turn out right. You might go back to the manipulatives again, but you're going to make sure that they've been really supported the first time they're doing a new thing. It's really frustrating to leave a child with new information, a new skill that they're supposed to know and have to do it alone. It's really good to, when something's new, to really sit there and help them get through that. When you're doing a new thing, try to correct that independent work if there is any. I mean, maybe you're going to go through it all with them really pretty quickly. If it's not new, it's not so crucial. But, you know, if it's a new big idea at lunch or some other time, make sure that you've corrected it and you can get back to them. And it's really great if you can notice a pattern. So rather than just saying to your child like, oh my gosh, you missed a third of these problems, it's really better if you can go back and say, you know, you got everything right unless you had to carry a 2 instead of a 1. So, you know, I think you totally understand this, except I don't think you understand that whatever, whatever. If you can just point out the pattern, first of all, it's more helpful to the child to improve, and to themselves start to think, oh, it's all about patterns, right? But it's also just less frustrating to the child if you're able to say like, oh, really, it looks like most of your mistakes are because of this. And the other thing that is really great about homeschooling is a lot of times one child might have the same kind of pattern over and over again. And so that can be really useful too, to say, have you noticed that what the last 3 problems, whatever they're in, you're not putting the same amount of effort into it? Does that seem like that to you? Or it could just be like, I think the problem you're having is you are not writing neatly enough to read your own writing sometimes. Do you think that's possible? So you can do things like that where you're helping a child to find patterns, but just try to phrase it in a way that isn't super critical, but more like, hey, we're problem solving here. Do you think this is a problem too? So let's say we're done with that and we're on to review. Like they finished their problems, everything's going well. So a great review that we did here is they got to sell cookies. And so, we made the cookies and they got to sell them to the people in the family. And of course, the numbers involved them in their head carrying a little bit so that they could use the dimes and the pennies. And, that was very exciting. And then you can go up a little higher the next day or a week later or whatever, and add milk and cookies and fruit or whatever so that they can have that experience of actually doing it as part of their review. So that doesn't end there though, because it's a really big topic, and part of that spiral that's possible in homeschooling is just keep building on it. So the next time I was at the farmer's market, I gave them a little bit of money in change and said to them, like, you can buy 3 apples or you can buy a cookie and something else, but you have to show me first how that would work. Like, how would you do the regrouping in your head so that they can work it out with me, do the math problem, go pay the person and get the cookie or the apple. Super rewarding. You can do it, several times over and over. You could go to the candy store. You could then move on to bigger numbers. Because it's really great to always use one thing to set up another thing, if you wanted to, in these last money situations, that are getting more complicated, like your next step is to ask the child to, in their mind, think about change back. So like the next step would be when you did this to say, well, I don't actually have, dimes and pennies or whatever, but I have this many dollars. But if you did that, like, about how much do you think you would get back? And it's not necessary for them to come up with the right answer exactly. If they do, great. Actually, I've been really happily surprised a lot of times. But the bigger idea is that you then can use that to set up for your next thing, which would be borrowing or subtraction, where you're going to subtract a number from the tens or the hundreds or whatever. And so in the same situation, we're interconnecting these ideas, right? We're borrowing and carrying, and we're laying the foundation or building for the next situation. Renee, what do you want to add to this first one? I have another one with older kids coming, but this is my example for the younger kids.
I think this is all really fantastic information, Helen. And this really, when you're thinking of the younger child, how you're building on what they've learned, you're reviewing what they've learned, you're showing them real world experiences that pertain to what they're learning. All of that builds excitement, it builds satisfaction, and most importantly, it's reinforcing that lesson, and it's helping that stick in their brain, so when they move on to more complicated concepts, they really have a grasp on what you've already taught them. So all of this is really fabulous. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks, Fred. Okay, so now I wanted to do the same thing with an older child. So we're going to skip ahead to high school. You know, in an ideal world, I would also do one for middle school, but I'm hoping that this is enough to give you just a feel for how this works. So let's say that I know that I'm going to do a series of debates with my children the next year. And so I did teach debate, as many of you know, for many, many years at Consortium. But before that, I did it with my 4 older children at our house. And debate is a really great way to combine a lot of topics and have a very hands-on experience. If you don't have 4 teenagers, you know, the obvious thing to do is you probably have a friend who has some teenagers, or you may have older siblings, or you know, other relatives love to debate too. And you know, there's a lot of ways that you can work this, and whether you do it at a homeschooling group or you do it at home. But basically, it's the same idea of building. So I knew that I was going to do a debate that would be something about, can the global community come up with innovative ways to make sure there's enough water for everyone in the coming century? So, or a decade, I think it might be a decade. But anyway, so in the family trips that we're taking the summer before, I know what topics are going to be on the debate. You know, I know about the things we're going to do. So when we're at different relatives' homes, rather than just, you know, the same old, you can bring up these topics and have your children start to understand what other people are saying about them. When people come over to dinner at your house, you can bring them up. Now, it's very hard for me to do this, so hopefully you're better at this than me. But in an ideal scenario, you're not that obvious about what side of it you fall on, right? You're going to let your child do the research and talk to people about it. So anyway, in our situation, our children were able to talk to people in the West about drought, about how that affected crops, about that, how that was affecting the environment in the area that those people lived in, and also relatives in the Midwest who had a lot different ideas about water. So that just kind of sets it up, and they're starting to think about it. Depending on how your family is, it could be that you're all going to start debating right there, but it's also possible to just let, you know, an older relative say what they think, and in the car when you're driving to the next place, or whatever the scenario is, to just talk about it for a few minutes. I mean, maybe you're going to talk about it for hours, who knows, but even if you talk about it for a few minutes, it's just starting to build this idea with your child, right? So here's my son enjoying the Catskill waterfall. So the other thing is to go on hikes or field trips or science trips where building up, your child is in a lot of different situations where people are talking about water. And so if you're on a science field trip, even about something else, you can go to the section of the Science Museum that's about water in some way as just a piece of building it. You don't have to say a lot, but you can just say, hey, I want you to read this, or we're going to go through this exhibit about water. If you're in a situation where there's a tour guide or there's a speaker and they say something about this issue, you know, you can just in the car briefly mention, oh, did you hear this about that? And again, it's probably not just about this one debate, but, you know, in your mind, you're thinking, these things are coming. And so I want to sort of build this idea with my child. So if you are I happen to go to church with a lot of scientists, so it's really easy to have, you know, be in conversation where people are, you know, thinking about these things. So, you know, it's just part of the conversation that you can sort of lead to your child to. So you can also sort of notice if the topic is in the news. So, you know, global water, a little harder, but there's a lot of debates you could do that would be in the news. And so as you're driving along or you're listening to the news at night or whatever the scenario is, you can just start to point out pieces of this debate. And they don't have to all exactly be on the center. You know, it doesn't have to be exactly about the topic. It can be anything that's connected, sort of like a spider web of connections. So your child, because again, your child is starting to build, your child is starting to spiral into this topic, but it can start out pretty wide, like what is their knowledge in general? All right, so going on with this idea, still building, you could choose to, as a family, watch a couple of documentaries, particularly if you have the time or the patience to watch conflicting sides of a documentary, right? Like maybe one idea about the documentary and another idea about the documentary. It could be that you go to the Science Center and, they have an IMAX film on it. It could be that you're just going to find, anyway, so, you also can really make homeschooling shine if you incorporate water issues, because that's one of the things you're going to talk about that year leading up to it when you're in history. So, it could be that you're going to talk about in history, like, water, rivers are the highways of the ancient world. It could be that you would talk about, cities and water supply in the history of the world. There's lots of ways that you can casually, as you're teaching history, build in ideas about water. The science is the same thing. You can see, so that you don't have to say a lot, but as these different topics are sort of swirling around, if you can pull in the topic of water so that your child is starting to build more and more of their thinking incrementally about this really big issue. You might even want to, kind of find a way to sort of have assignments cross over so that, if they had a science writing project or if they did have a history project, to try to have some part of that project, large or small, incorporate water so that even though they're not directly necessarily researching this topic, again, you're building towards what is going to come, what's going to happen. So it's the day where you're introducing the topic. And this particular topic was, can the global community successfully confront the water shortage? Okay, so that's the topic. And you're going to introduce the topic. One way you might do it is by two sort of, not too long YouTube videos, one on either side. You could also read something about one side and the other. And then, of course, the really rich thing here is you're, again, going to pull in all of the things that have happened before that. You can talk about what, Uncle Jim said about it. You can talk about, remember when we went to the Boston Science Museum and we saw this. You can pull in all of these past experiences that have happened. It could be, I wrote this. And it starts to be that your child realizes that even though they haven't yet specifically studied this topic, they understand how this topic fits together with a variety of different things, and that they know a fair amount about the topic. So talking through past news, past reading, past research, you're going to ask a lot of questions. And in an ideal situation, unless it's something that you just can't pretend to have any other view on, I don't think you want to fake that you have no view on it, but try to still be open to the other idea. Because it's really better for the child's thinking skills, if they're thinking through, okay, this is one train of thought, and this is the other train of thought. So then you're going to make this assignment, and in this case, you're going to tell them, for my children at home, they were pretty much always doing both debates. They were finding information on both debates, and then they were going to switch sides. Almost always they did that. You still can write this assignment down on the board, and it's really important even with teens that you're really clear about what you're expecting. How many pages is this going to be? How many points should there be in each of their big ideas? How many, what are you expecting for research? Just really lay out on the board when it's going to be due, what you're expecting, how it's all going to go together. Taking Sides is a book that I don't even know, there might be 40 editions of Taking Sides, where people who are very renowned experts in a field will take different sides for an issue. And so that's a case where it's all laid out, and your child just reads, what one side and then the other side of an issue. And, you know, usually you probably want them, well, possibly you want them to explore it a little more. Maybe you don't, but you know, I think that you probably do. So let's say that it's that day. It's the teach the lesson day. So in this scenario, you probably figured it out that actually your children are teaching the lesson, right? I mean, they have gone and found the information and they're going to debate each other, whether you're going to have them switch sides or you're going to have them each stick to the side. They're going to be doing most of the talking. But you're still an active participant here. Your job is to ask questions, help them learn to clarify things as gently as possible, try to help them understand the inconsistencies. It's important that this isn't like, and you're wrong, because somebody has to take the right side and the wrong side as whatever you might think. But what you're just trying to help them understand here is what they wrote down. Does that make sense? You know, is that consistent? Does it have logical fallacies? Is there fuzzy thinking in there? And a big thing is the repercussions of poor research, right? Assumably, there'll always be somebody who didn't do as much research as the other person. And this is a fantastic way to pull this all together. You might want to have your child switch partway through the debate. Sides you might not. If at all possible, you can use a little bit of help on diction and other verbal skills, particularly if you end up doing this in a larger group. But even if it's just your child, it's really possible to, you know, push that in. But again, don't overdo it. Don't be too critical. Don't feel the need to comment on every single thing, right? You're going to still give the positive feedback, and you're going to let the child have the joy of starting to experience this idea that, you know, you can't just say something, right? You have to have really specific research, or you have to have experts that are saying that that's true. You know, just because you say it doesn't make it true. You have to have done research that you can then go through and support. So that's the actual, you know, that's how the actual lesson looks. The actual lesson is doing the thing. So when you're done, this is a part that I didn't usually do in big groups teaching at consortium, because it's very time prohibitive, but I know a lot of parents did it when they got home, is that you're going to talk through the debate. You're going to talk about what went well, what didn't go well. You're going to give positive feedback. You're going to discuss what each child believes. Why do they come to that conclusion? Talk about what other people believe and why do they think that. And this is sometimes the most interesting part of the debate, is afterwards at home, when you're thinking it all through and you're making connections. So this is a great time to then tie this topic in with future topics that are going to happen. So in their particular case, it was population, you know, overpopulation size or not, and global urbanization. Like, what are the pros and cons of global urbanization? So you can kind of follow that, right? In some places, if too many people go to one area and leave another, is there enough water? You know, there's just one easy thing. So you're going to build those connections, and you might also recall other debates, and you're going to build those connections. You're thinking of how it all fits together, and you can have such rich conversations doing this. You might practice the debate again with an older sibling over the phone. Some people like to debate the other parent when they come home. Some people like to you know, continue the conversation at dinner. You might instead have a friend who does the same debates you do, and after you've done it at home, you do it with their children. You might have a homeschool group, small or large, where you can again practice that debate. So then how does review work into this? Like, this is a really pretty open-ended thing, but review still does work in. You can ask your child to do a research paper or a news video clip about the topic that they send to relatives, or just keep for a funny thing that you look at later. You could bring up key points to the debate as they come up over the next year. Like, it could be 2 years later that somehow you're somewhere again at a science museum or listen to something on the news. You are with your child all the time, and so you have the ability to keep connecting everything constantly connecting. You can always be circling back. You can always be spiraling up. You can constantly be making everything fit together. And this is wisdom, right? This is what knowledge is at its best. It's not that you just understand these things in a vacuum. You start to see how things can fit together. So basically, these are two examples of how this can work together, how you can do this homeschooling specific lesson. Renee, what do you think?
Helen taught debate. I love that she picked debate as an example here. She taught debate it in addition to her children at home, but also at the Hudson Valley Consortium. And it was a wildly popular class. And she has taught, I'm sure, hundreds of students to debate, including my two oldest children. And they are excellent debaters because of what she's done and her teaching techniques. And it really works. And these children, my children came back and we used these same techniques at home. So even though she was the main teacher in debate, we did the same things that she's talking about. We're talking to family, we're bringing issues up, we're reinforcing it and giving that child an opportunity to learn more, but also to show us what they're learning.
And Renee has done so much to help my children learn to write. So when we have the writing session, hopefully we'll hear more about Renee's amazing techniques in that area. So here's another way to actually teach a lesson. And I'm going to call these project-based lessons. And these are situations where you couldn't do everything like this, but again, I'm just trying to show you different ways to teach lessons. And sometimes a field trip, big or small, or a trip is a standalone lesson. So for example, I might be going to my local nature center, and this is one that we did, and they have a special thing because the frogs are out, the peepers are peeping, you can see tadpoles jumping, and so they've got that going on. They have their own hands-on experiment that you can do. They've got a little craft you can do, and your child's going to listen to a talk. So there are things in your community that you go, and it's a standalone lesson. All you have to do on your own is just review a little bit and maybe, throw in a book here or there, but at the book table that you have. There's lots of possibilities for standalone lessons that you actually really aren't doing much about. So a trip to the gypsum mine could be a standalone experience because maybe your child is doing some mining for gypsum. There's someone there talking about gypsum. There's activities about gypsum. There's a workshop. It's a standalone thing. A big trip can work the same way. Renee and I took some of our children to Italy, and then there's another time my husband and I took our older children to Italy. And just being there, going on lots of having lots of tours of different places, I mean, that in itself can be a lesson. And again, you just have to review afterwards, provide a couple books, maybe a documentary, and it's really a standalone situation. Williamsburg is one that I took all of my children to in groups, like first the oldest four, the middle four, the youngest, whatever. So if you've ever been to Williamsburg, you know that there's people talking, there's people acting stuff out. You just can't quite keep yourself from buying your children those hats that everybody else has. And there's constant activities happening so that it's pretty standalone. If you listen to a book on tape on the way down, you've probably done it all, but without doing anything after that besides review. So realize that sometimes you can just go somewhere and somebody else is providing a lesson and all you have to do is do review. Sometimes you can have a situation where you have an expert that your child is working with a little bit, or maybe it's a standalone thing, and they do individual research. They do original research even on their own. And this is a thing a lot of homeschoolers find ways to do. So my two oldest, actually working with a nature center in the area, found, without making it really long, did some research discovering animals that were coming back to habitats that they didn't think they were, and a couple plants that were coming back to, it's not like they thought these were extinct, but they didn't think they were in this particular area. And then they were so proud of themselves, they did a little professional presentation about it. And then their pictures and a couple little videos were actually something that could go into a little exhibit for a while at that nature center. Like, oh, look, these things are coming back. Have you seen them? So it's not like that research became, a cure for cancer, although there's homeschoolers doing that kind of thing. But the idea that they had this complete project on their own that they were going to go and do original research on, they were going to read books about, was very intriguing to them. They really enjoyed having that experience where it was completely on their own to write this paper, to make this presentation. Sometimes an actual project that you make can become a lesson. So we homeschooled with a young man who built a balsa plane that was, I don't know, like it was 6 feet long or something. And then he launched it into the air. It was the most amazing moment, right? And he had researched it and, figured all that out. Here's a picture of something I showed earlier of my children doing a to scale map to show the topography of where they lived, and they had to do a lot of research on that to figure out how to do something to scale, how map making works. There's so many pieces to go with that. So sometimes an actual project, research, or a trip, these all become a standalone lesson, and all it is for you to do is to research or discuss it. But even these things are really elevated if, again, you can find ways to incorporate what's happened that the child did individually with other things that you know or that are happening. Just going to have one real quick last thing and then hand over to Renee. So there's many ways to teach a lesson, but I've gone over a couple here. You might use a scripted lesson. You might use that real basic 3 idea where you tell them what you're going to tell them, you review, or you're going to introduce it with an experiment or a hook, but then you're going to tell them and you're going to review. I went over that the homeschool specific process of building, then doing introduction, doing a lesson, making connections and practicing and reviewing. And now I've thrown out some ideas about project-based lessons. Of course, there's lots of different ways. The big idea is that combining these and using other methods, like that variety is a really rich experience for your child, right? Not that it's always the same. It's that there's these different ways that a lesson can be presented. I think that the thing I hope that you are getting, though, is that asking questions, making connections, putting things in context, however you use it, this is the really powerful thing about homeschooling. This is just something that, as wonderful as schools and as necessary as schools are, this is the one thing that you just really can't get from somebody who isn't with you so much of the time, right? I mean, this is a really big deal. So take advantage of it. Take advantage of all these moments of your life that can be used for building, however you want to do it. I can go on with this forever. I can see I'm going to do it. I really hope, though, that this has been helpful for you. I hope it was specific enough to give you some ideas about how you can actually teach a homeschool lesson, and I'm sure that you will do fabulously. Renee, did you want to add something before we end this session?
Helen, this is all wonderful. I'm really so glad that you did this session on teaching a lesson. These techniques are so valuable, and when we're thinking again about the long game and how we're building and building and building, you're going to see how these techniques really pay off for your children and your family as time goes on. And when you're looking as your children go off to college, when they know what, Helen brought up some examples such as going to museums, going to places where they can have these standalone lessons. These are things that I know my children have incorporated in college. They have knowledge that they would not have otherwise had, or they would have only had from a textbook, that you've given them just by going to the local museum. Whatever museum is local for you, you can go to the local museum, and you can start young and cultivate that love of museums for a child who may not love museums. And they can hear, when we talk about the many voices, they can hear the museum guide talk to them and present this information in ways that maybe you may not have, and click with them in a way that's different. And projects, when Helen was talking about the projects, this is exactly what they're going to be doing in college. They're going to be doing their own research. They're going to be looking for original texts. And you've had that opportunity in your homeschool to give them some experience with that. So they really start at college understanding how to do those things, having a familiarity with certain materials. Like Helen said, when you have them at home, you have this opportunity to be building on all of these layers and exposing how that lesson, how that information that you've taught them affects them in multiple ways in every avenue of their life. So thank you, Helen.
Thanks for listening, you guys. I hope it was helpful. Have a great day.